good evening and welcome to tonight's Dean's Lecture. This is the last of the 2013 series and some of you are regular attendees and I thank you for that, and for all of you I thank you for supporting tonight's event. I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional custodians of the land on which we hold this lecture, so I pay respects to elders both past and present. At the conclusion of Tony's presentation, I've asked Professor John Policell if he would make a few closing remarks and make a presentation. And after that, I'll invite you outside into the foyer because we always conclude these lectures with a couple of refreshments, which gives you a chance to interact with each other and with our guest speaker. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tony, and many of you will know a bit about him. But Professor Tony Watts, OBE, is the founding fellow and life president of the National Institute for Career Education and Counselling in the UK, and was director from 1975 to 2001. He was also a co-founder of the Careers Research and Advisory Centre, but he also has some university roles as well. He's a visiting professor at the University of Derby and at Christchurch University. His work covers theory, policy and practice in all sectors of career education and guidance, including schools, further and higher education and adult guidance. In recent years, his main interests have been policy-related studies, both nationally and internationally, and in evaluations of innovative practice. He's been a consultant to a number of international organisations, the OECD, the World Bank, the European Commission and the European Training Foundation. He's covered many countries. In his lecture, and he will give you the full details, but I just want to say something about it because he's going to discuss a series of international reviews of career guidance systems for the OECD and other organisations. In our knowledge society, organisations are constantly exposed to change. They are therefore less willing to make long-term commitments to individuals in those organisations. And where the organisations do that, it's been in exchange for task and role flexibility. This transforms the definition of career to, quote, the individual's lifelong progression in learning and work, the individual's lifelong progression in learning and work. So in this environment, public policy goals for guidance services have been radically reframed to support policies related to lifelong learning and linked to sustaining employability and the development of human capital. This places career guidance centre stage, and Tony will tell you more about that. But Tony's had a long association with the Graduate School of Education over many years. Indeed, working with a number of our academic staff on both research and teaching related activities. Every year for the last 10 years, he's provided generously the students from our Master of Education Policy International degree with informative and incisive lectures on careers education when they visited Cambridge University. Indeed, I wasn't enrolled in the course, but I muzzled my way into one of those experiences, and so we have actually met before, so I'm glad you've now come back to us. But he also, in those visits, has great pride in showing our students around his alma mater, particularly St Cat's College, and entertaining them with some wonderful stories about academics who dared to disobey the "don't walk on the grass" signs, and we didn't. So it is with a sense of anticipation and great pleasure that I welcome to the lectern Professor Tony Watts, who will present cross-national reviews of career guidance systems, overview and reflections. Tony, welcome to Melbourne, welcome to the Graduate School, and welcome to the lectern.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and You did explain to me that the amount of apparatus is a mark of respect. But I've never had quite so much. I feel I'm going to blow up any minute, actually. But anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for that lovely introduction. Actually, you've given the first half of my lecture, actually, so that's fine. So I can... Yeah, well, exactly. No, it's great to be here, and my links with the university have been actually not just the study visit. There have been quite a lot of links over time. I spent a year at OECD, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. Incidentally, this is a rather interesting day to be talking about OECD, isn't it? Did you read the papers, listen to the news this morning? It's all over it. So anyway, I'm going to talk about that. But I was there for a year, just over a year, actually 13 months, in 2001, 2002. And I'm going to talk about that. But I was surrounded by people from Victoria. I mean, Barry McGaw was my boss. Richard Sweet, who, he lives in Sydney, but he works, I think he's a professor here, visiting professor, was my colleague, and I was working with him all the time. Phil Mackenzie was also a colleague, and of course Jack Keating above all, and because I want to mention Jack in particular, because of course, very sadly he died last year. I had a great affection and respect for Jack. I'm thrilled what you're doing to sustain his memory here with the scholarship and so on. And I had a lovely conversation with Linnell at the weekend, and about Jack. We talked long about Jack. So I just wanted to say that. I mean, I'm really thrilled to be here, partly because this is where Jack was. And Jack actually set up those contacts with the study visits, which have been great fun. I've always greatly enjoyed it. And we did a report, actually, for the Victorian Department of Education on career development, core business, which Richard led, but Jack was involved in, and Veronica was involved, I think, and various people. So there have been quite a lot of links. So I'm going to be talking, now this title, actually, when I walked in, there was a placard saying what the title was, and I did actually say to Tristan, actually, that isn't the sexiest title that one could have thought of, was it? You know, but at least you've all come, so thank you very much indeed for coming. I hope it will be of some interest. I mean, what I'm going to be talking about is about this series of cross-national reviews, which I was involved in starting with OECD, but then continuing through other organisations, World Bank and European Commission and its agencies, extended to cover 55 countries. And I was very privileged to be part of that. And what I'm going to be talking about is how we did them, a bit about methodology, what we learned from them, and what the role is of these kinds of reviews, and what we can learn from cross-national studies of that kind. And I know your centre does a lot. I mean, the study visits are to do with cross-national studies. So I hope it will be of interest in relation to all of that. But I'm also going to be framing this within what in Australia you call career development. In OECD we called it career guidance. In Europe we tend to call it lifelong guidance. But it's the whole range of activities which are concerned with helping people to make career choices and transitions throughout their lives. And that was the basis of the OECD review. We were interested in anything that moved, that was concerned with that, right the way through to what happened in primary and elementary school, right the way to third age issues. I mean, I have made a very big criticism. In a year's time, I'm going to retire from all professional activities. That is a very big career decision, actually. And it is a career decision. It's about what I'm planning to do. So we're all making these decisions throughout our lives, and that is a big change in the way in which we conceptualize all of this work. And it's linked with what the Dean was saying about the way in which the world has changed. We used to think, and I'm conscious that some of you know all of this very well, but others perhaps not. This is not a field that you particularly focused on, so I thought I'd say a little bit about it for the beginning, just to kind of provide the frame for the rest of the lecture. We used to think about how people chose careers, and the concept of a career was progression up an ordered hierarchy within an organisation or profession, kind of Weberian kind of concept, and bureaucratic concept in many ways, and of course by definition elitist. Some people have careers, many people don't. And some people resisted the use of this word because they say it only applies to the few. We shouldn't use this elitist phrasing. So that was the old concept. The way I think we now think about it, much more definitions vary, but my own definition would it be about the individual's progression in learning and work throughout life. And that is a very different kind of definition, and is in principle available to everybody, actually. It is not exclusive, it is not elitist. And I use the words quite carefully. It's learning, not just formal education, it's also training and informal learning. I use work because it's not just paid employment, it's also self-employment, and it's all the other forms of work we all engage with in voluntary work and in our households and so on and so forth. That is also work. But it's also about progression, and it's about development throughout life. And the issue is whether we can actually help people to do that. Everybody in principle has a career if we can help them to understand that and to help to know how to manage it. And so therefore, the focus now is on how we help people not to choose their careers, but to construct their careers throughout life. And that was why in the OECD review and the subsequent reviews, we were interested in that whole lifelong progression. So it's what happens in schools, what happens in TAFE, what happens in universities, what happens in public employment services, what happens in the voluntary and community sector, what happens in the workplace, and what happens in the private sector. All of those things, and there are a lot of things going on. And what we tried to do was to look at those as a system, which of course they're not. They're actually a series of disparate subsystems, most of which are part of something else. So in schools you have something to do with career development and it's part of the school system. Ditto in TAFE, ditto and so on. But what we try to do is to look at it as an entity, the notion being that the more coherent and the more transparent it is to the individual, the more likely they are to be able to get that support throughout their lives in terms of their lifelong career development. So that was the underlying rationale. And the underbit of the rationale was that actually this matters in terms of public policy. Because this is not just a private good, it's a public good. If it was a private good only of interest to the individual, who can use it if they wish and not if they don't want to, it's not an issue in terms of public policy. But the argument is, which we put very strongly in the OECD review, and the basis of subsequent reviews is, no, this is a public good, because for two main reasons. The first is that if people are making choices about their learning and work in a well-informed and well-thought-through way, and I emphasize both of those, it's not just about information. Information is necessary but not sufficient. It's also well thought through. These are decisions about people's lives. They're big, big decisions. They're not decisions about a commodity. They're decisions about lives. Then there are, if they make those decisions in a well-informed, well-thought-through way, that has public benefits in relation to the learning system, the education training system, in which we invest masses of money, works best when people are finding places within it which motivate them, where they're using their distinctive energies, their distinctive motivations, their distinctive talents. If they find those pathways, then the system works. And if they don't, it doesn't. People drop out. People, they go backwards. So there is waste of resources. Ditto in the labour market. If people find forms of work which utilise their distinctive skills and capacities and their motivations and their values, all of that, that has benefits in terms of productivity and in terms of the economy. And then the other argument is about social equity and social justice, which is that people with a lot of resources around their family have a lot of forms of support, but many from disadvantaged communities do not. And the task is, in terms of public policy, to ensure that they too get access to the resources and help to support them in making those choices. So there are arguments about the learning system, the labour market, but there are also arguments about social equity and social justice. And those are the policy arguments. And if you read the policy statements on all this, those are the arguments that are there. and they're framed in different ways, and the balance varies upon the nature of the political party, and so on and so forth, but those are the arguments. So that's, I think, is the rationale, and that was what inspired these reviews, and recognising also that all of that help and form of support has got to be remodelled if we're going to extend it in that way. And incidentally, as far as Australia is concerned, one of the things we did say in the report, and I think it's still true, is that by international standards, what you provide for young people is pretty good, but for adults not, actually. And I did say when we had our informal feedback as part of the review, I did say, I know you're a young country, but you're not that young anymore. And actually, the adult issues are really, really important, and somehow it still doesn't seem to get the attention. I think it still tends to drift back to young people, which is not the case elsewhere, actually, in quite a lot of other countries. In fact, in the UK, paradoxically, and actually wrongly, we're actually doing more for adults than we are for young people, but I won't go into that today. Okay, that's the kind of basis for this, and I suppose I'll start putting up these things. That's lessons learned. That was the definition. We talked a bit about that. That was the change of the concept of career. And this is the change in terms of how we think about career guidance. We used to have a kind of medical model. So as a career advisor, sort of issue some questionnaires and so forth, and then kind of matched it in terms of the occupations and so forth, and came up with a suggestion, a prescription. So it was a medical model, diagnosis and prescription. I think that, I mean, I'm not saying there's no benefit in that ever, but I think the focus now, because it's about helping individuals to construct their own throughout life, it's about learning. That is what it's about. It's about helping people to learn about themselves, learn about the world of the learning structure and the labour market, and to develop the skills for making decisions, making transitions throughout their lives. So that's what it's about. And those are the public policy goals. I've talked about those, and now we're on the reviews. Right, we've caught up. Okay, I don't like PowerPoint. Right, the international reviews. Prior to the OECD review, I'd done quite a few of these already, actually. I did a number for the European Commission. I did one for UNESCO. I did one for OECD, actually. But most of them were about young people. Most of them, not all actually, but most of them were. The one I'm going to be talking about today was the OECD one, which then was multiplied. And this is far the biggest, far the broadest, and far the most interesting, I think, of all these ones I've been involved in. And I only got, well, I knew Richard Sweet. Richard was working at OECD, and we talked about this review, and he said he'd like me to be involved in writing some papers and visiting a country or two. And then I got a telephone call one Friday morning, and he said, we've got quite a lot of countries who are interested in this. Would you like a year in Paris? So I thought, well, that's quite a nice telephone call. But I was thinking of planning to retire from being director of NICEAG in a year's time, and I said, oh, Richard, in a year's time it would have been perfect, but I don't think I can. Because about 7 things rushed into my head about things, commitments I had and so on. But I said, I will think about it over the weekend. I will ring you back on Monday morning. Best thing I ever did. Because I thought, well, I can do that. Yes, somebody else can do that. No. And on Monday morning I rang up and said, okay, I'm on. So, and it was a fabulous year, absolutely fabulous year, working with some great people and great privilege, and with all 14 countries. And OECD is a very interesting organisation. I work with quite a lot of these international organisations. As an organisation to work with, for me, it's far the best. Because actually, it's not very political. I mean, UNESCO is very political, the European Commission is very political, but OECD isn't. It actually lives off the quality of its professional work. That's what it does. And there's some very, very bright people doing some very interesting work. And of course, all the PISA stuff is all, linked with all of that. And I did work over the corridor. Andrea Schleicher was on the other side of the corridor doing all this PISA stuff. But in our review, we were mainly qualitative. They have actually included some questions on career guidance in the new one, and actually in the previous one. The new one, they're a bit more extensive, but they're elective. Countries can use them or not. So I haven't looked at the data yet, but I'm quite interested in what it is. But ours was qualitative. And I think what we were doing was a kind of cross-national review, and OECD does this in a wide range of policy areas. And what they are about is enabling the participating countries to benchmark their progress in the relevant policy area against other comparable countries and to share good practice, promoting their successes, and also learning from practices elsewhere. I think that's what it's about. And I think it's a powerful process, actually. OECD decides to do this. It was supported both by on the education side and on the labour market side, which was quite important in terms of its endorsement. And it was linked to the whole move towards lifelong learning, active labour market policies, and OECD's interest in all of those. And what we did was we visited the 14 countries. Richard and I divided the countries between us. And the first deal was I would come to Australia and he would do the UK. Well, that's fairly obvious, but I thought, great, fantastic, have come to Australia. And what I did when I was here, came with a colleague from Canada, and in 8 working days, we tried to understand what was happening here in that huge range of things. So we visited 4 states, and we talked to masses and masses of people, exhausted. We had lots of documentation beforehand, and out of it we produced a report, which we then passed it back, of course, for comment, but people did recognise it. And I think there's something about how in a short space of time, if you're quite good at asking quite good questions and of listening and recording and so on and so forth, you can get a kind of bird's eye view. You can pick out the important stuff. I think probably to get to another level of detail, as it were, and of understanding, you've probably got to spend a couple of months there, actually. In other words, I think the whole essence of this is that you're coming in, you're looking at things in very broad terms and strategic terms. And a lot of it, what you're doing is triangulation. You hear something there, you hear something there, and you hear something there, and you try and work out what you think the truth is. And you look at documentary evidence as well. But if you think about it, with the complexity of Australia and the fact that, the relationship with the States and the Commonwealth and so forth, and all those different sectors, it was challenging and totally exhausting. But I think we produced a report which did have some credibility, and it did have some impact, I think. And there were some things which were done as a result of it, which was good to see. So we did that, and we did it in 14 countries, most of them European, plus Australia, Canada, and Korea actually was one of them. And then the World Bank decided to use a slightly different methodology, but based broadly the same methodology, to conduct a review in 7 middle-income countries. So that was countries like Chile, Philippines, Russia, South Africa. Quite an interesting range of countries, actually. And then the European Commission said, well, we're going to do something for all our member countries and the candidate countries applying for membership. So that was a lot of countries. A lot of that was simply questionnaire. We didn't have visits there, which I'll talk about that in a moment, about the importance of visits. And then we pulled all that together. That was 37 countries, and did a synthesis, and we had a big conference and so on and so forth. And then the European Training Foundation, which is the kind of outward-looking arm of the European Commission. It works in the neighbouring countries, so it helped the candidate countries. Once they became part of the EU, it was the next lot of countries, the Balkan countries, and then the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. And we've done reviews there. And that's a very, very interesting range of countries in the Balkans, Croatia, Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, Albania, and others. And then the Middle East and North Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, West Bank and Gaza Strip, Syria, Tunisia, and Turkey. What is the role of career development in the West Bank and Gaza Strip? But we did find things. There are some NGOs doing things which are definitely about career development. So even there we did find things. But of course the concepts are very different, and the situation is very, very different. So it was quite a wide range of countries. We used a broadly similar methodology there. And then there were some other things that we did. We did a review of career guidance in relation to public employment services across Europe, which was linked with this in some ways, which is always a contested area because public employment services have other baggage. They're trying to get people off benefit. So where career guidance, and they're trying to get people into jobs quickly. So where does career guidance, which is of its nature more long-term, fit in relation to that? But if you talk about sustainable employment, it is, and some countries take that quite seriously. So we did that. And then I did a review of, there were 3 or 4 countries that have had all-age career guidance services. And I was particularly interested in those. And in the OECD review, at that time, Wales had such a service. And we looked at it and we thought we were really impressed with this as a model. Because what an all-age service does is provide a kind of professional spine to a genuine lifelong guidance system. And it's easier to think about it systemically if there is that kind of spine, which is dealing with all ages, but always working in partnership with all the other sectors. So you have an all-age career guidance service working in partnership with schools, in partnership with colleges and universities, in partnership with public employment services, employers, voluntary sector, etc. But there's a kind of coherence because it provides professional spine and some degree of continuity in relation to that. So if it's strategic, it can do a lot more. And we were very impressed with the model. And we were very impressed actually by some of the things that they were doing in Wales. And there are a couple of other countries that have done that. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, that they had similar services. And actually in New Zealand, they had. And I was asked to do reviews on each of those. And that was extremely interesting. And I was impressed by all of them. And I think reaffirmed in my sort of view that is one of the strongest models. It's not the only model, but it is a particularly strong model. And then I did a review in Hungary, which was very interesting, which was where they got a lot of European Social Fund money and built something from scratch, which was really brilliant. But of course, when the money ran out, sustainability was the key issue, and a lot of it's collapsed since then, but it was very impressive in its own terms. So anyway, lots of bits and pieces. But covering, when I actually thought, well, I'll sit down and write down how many countries there have been covered, and there were 55, and that is the biggest. Yes, please.
Did you include the US?
No, well, there were some conspicuous omissions. With OECD, US could have volunteered. It's voluntary, which shows these countries put up their hand, and they said, no, they didn't. I mean, there are lots of these reviews, and each country chooses which one it's going to be involved in, and the US didn't. Which was a pity in many ways. So there has been no review of the US, and that would be very complex because a lot of it, again, is at the state level, and there are lots of states. But there were also some other omissions. We didn't have China, didn't have India, so there's 2 other massive countries we haven't covered. Much of Asia, Africa, and South America are fairly thinly represented. So I'm not saying by any means it's global, it's not. There are conspicuous omissions. However, it is quite an impressive number of countries and quite an impressive range of countries. There's been nothing like it before, and I think there's a lot to be learnt from it. So, but yeah, you're quite right about that. Okay, where are we? Where are we on time? What time do we...
You've got 25 minutes.
I've got 25 minutes. Terrific. Okay, are you okay with this? Can you stand 25 more? Okay. Right, a little bit about methodology. I mean, you might not be very interested in methodology. I'm very interested in methodology. How does one do this? And I think the methodology is quite interesting because it's linked with the issue of what do you get from inside and what do you get from outside? And I think how you do this, and we've tried a number of different things. I've said what the OECD method, which I thought was very good. We had this detailed questionnaire and we got these detailed responses. I mean, I think around 100 pages of stuff from Australia, I think. It was a commission, somebody was commissioned to do it, and it was extremely good, actually, very, very good. We got masses of stuff, and of course includes lots of references, which you can follow up as well. So there's a lot of stuff we get, which means that when you go, you read all this stuff and all the other documents. When I did my review in Wales, they sent me 4 boxes of documents to go through. I mean, seriously, that sort of stuff. And you go through it. But what it means is that when you actually go, you've got lots of information, but also got lots of questions. I don't understand that. That seems to say that, but what about that over there? So you've got some starting points. You've got some picture in your mind, but I say lots and lots of questions. So I think that's a very important part of it. But I think the visits are absolutely crucial, and there's no question in my mind that in the European stuff, where we've got lots of data, but we didn't have visits, and it's a lot poorer as a result. I mean, Ronald Sultana, who did the analysis of that, did a brilliant job, but he was clutching at straws a bit. But you don't know what you're really dealing with. You read something, you're not quite, you think it's this, but it probably isn't. Because you've got to actually know about context and about culture and meaning and so on to really, really understand it. When you're there, you can sharpen up your understanding. Without it, you can make mistakes. And I mean, although you try and validate it, you send drafts to people, but, I think it's much less satisfactory. So the visits, I mean, usually a week, and as I say, I think you can do a lot if it's well planned. And I mean, here, it was incredibly well planned. I mean, we were being shipped off a flight, we arrived, we immediately went to a group, then we always tried to go to at least to a school, we always tried to see some of the kids, so we tried to kind of just touch the people it's actually about. I mean, it's quite brief stuff, but you're trying to get some sense, and then you do something else. And then I remember, I don't know if it was here, but I think there was this, you all the time meet people, and somebody says, right, we'll take you out for dinner. How nice, and at the end of a very long day, and of course you get masses of stuff. And at this dinner, I think it was in Melbourne, there were about 10 people, and they alternated, so they'd say, we're each going to sit next to you. So you're trying to eat your food, and you're trying to take notes. So if you don't take notes, you won't retain it. And actually, they give you really good stuff then. So how do you eat and listen and take notes? Not easy. And you're exhausted anyway, and then you crash out, and then you start again the next day. So it is quite hard stuff, but absolutely fascinating. Really, really fascinating. So the visits are important. Then you produce a country report, and you send it in. We always did the final visit. We always had some senior policy people. We gave a feedback of these were our key, what we thought were probably our key conclusions and key recommendations, but we test them out, and then we send something, and so you get comments back and so on. In the case of the OECD review, it was co-authored by 2 externals, and I think that was the power of it in many ways. And because it had the imprimatur of OECD, that carries clout, and it has some kind of I mean, it's only 2 people after all, but you have to go through a bit of a process. You have to search some people and so on. And anyway, it's got OECD on it, and I think that does carry, and certainly some countries did do quite a lot with our report, including Australia, actually took it seriously. I think Australia, Scandinavian countries as well use OECD. You want people to look at what you're doing, you want to improve, and you want to learn from it. In the UK, I don't think we do. Not really. We think we're doing it well, and we often aren't. I mean, I'm not saying it does have impact. They do, but I think we're not quite as open. And there were some countries we went to where I knew, but in this particular case, they weren't going to do anything. They were going through the motions. In this particular case, Netherlands was one, normally quite an open country, but they didn't want to do anything in this area. They simply were going through it for various political reasons. So, we did it. We produced quite a good report, I think, but we knew nothing was going to happen. So it varies in terms of what actual impact it has. In the World Bank, we did it rather differently, actually. What we did is we got an internal consultant to complete the questionnaire, but we asked them to do it in the format of the draft report, and then somebody from outside, it was me in most of the cases, but Dave Fretwell and 1 or 2 others, came in and in effect rewrote what was there by asking all the questions from the visits and giving our kind of lens on this and so forth. And actually that was a quicker way of doing it because, and in the case of the World Bank it was fine. In the case of the World Bank it doesn't have that kind of external credibility, I don't think, unless there's funding attached to it. If there's funding that goes with it, then of course countries are very interested. And in some cases there was. Anyway, that sort of methodology worked quite well. So you do that anyway, you choose your country report, and then you synthesize all of this. So we had a synthesis report for the OECD, 14 countries, synthesis report for World Bank, 7 countries, and ditto, we had a series of these synthesis reports, and then we try to pull some of this together. So that's how it actually works. What can we learn? Well, I'm just going to give 6. There's lots and lots of things I could talk about, but I'll just talk about 6. The first obvious point: the nature of what is offered is strongly influenced by the political structure of the country, its level of economic development, social cultural factors, and so forth. The dynamics are very different in countries which are strongly centralized from where they're strongly decentralized and devolved, in post-industrial economies from less developed economies, in countries where Western values predominate from those with different value systems, in countries with extensive and well-developed formal guidance services to those with few, if any, such services. For instance, in Arabic countries, there is no word equivalent to career. The word does not exist. The concept, therefore, does not exist. Family influences and patronage tend to be very, very powerful, which can reinforce social inequities, but can also mitigate job loss and facilitate the search for new employment, because those family networks are enormously important. So the whole context is very, very different. And also in lots of countries, including those, there are very strong cultural tendencies towards much more directiveness and even fatalism, which changes the way in which all these kind of issues are even thought about. So there are quite deep cultural differences, and of course that's true within countries as well, where you get different cultures. And the pressures of globalization do produce some pressures towards homogenization, towards these things coming together, and you can see some degree of convergence, but it's very important to take account of those wider cultural, political, and economic differences in thinking about what is appropriate in that country. So it's always trying to get a mix of the two. I think the most interesting report we did on all this was in the MEDA countries, the Middle East and North African countries, where we had a very strong section on all of this. But we also did recognize the convergence issues and the fact that people were doing some things which were, and that was linked to the issues of globalization and so forth. So that's the first. Secondly, while governments have an interest in the provision of services to all on a lifelong basis, and that's the underpinning goal, is that wherever people are in their lives, they should have access to services and programs if they wish to use them, it does not necessarily follow that governments should pay for all of that. In most countries, services for young people are publicly provided as part of compulsory education. And in most countries, services for people who are unemployed are publicly provided because there is a state interest in getting them off benefit, and also they haven't got resources of their own. But for employed adults, that is not the case. And there are some really interesting and important issues about who should pay, who should provide, because actually that's where most people are for most of their lives. And how do we provide that kind of support? And that's where actually the economic arguments are. If people within the labour market are making these choices, thinking ahead, thinking about how they adapt to new demands and new opportunities, developing their skills and so forth, that's where the links with productivity and so forth are strongest. So how do we do all of that? And some companies do provide for their own employees, but what about those who want to move? Of course, some provide it when they want them to move, and that's where they actually sometimes pay big money. So they want them, they don't want them anymore, but they want them to go quietly, so they'll pay for a little bit of career guidance so that they can, and that's proper career guidance actually, but that's paid for sometimes by the employer, sometimes by the state. What's the role for people paying for it themselves? Is there a market here? And if there's a market, who does pay? I mean, is it the individual or the employer, for example? And I think the jury's still out on that. There is a market, but it's not a big market. Some people do pay, but they don't pay big money. And people who do work in that market sometimes do it alongside all sorts of other stuff about coaching and so on and so forth. So they can get a market, but they recognise in order to build a proper business, they need to link it to something wider. So the issue about whether it could become more of a market is an important public policy issue, actually. And what we said in the OECD review, and repeated in the others, was that if it is a public good, it does not necessarily follow that the state should pay, but the roles of government within that kind of market are threefold. First of all, to stimulate the market, because if it's a public good, the more it happens, the better. So stimulating the market, quality assuring the market, because if it's going to grow, there's not much point if it's not good, and then to compensate for market failure. Because there are some groups that will not be able to be met in that kind of way. Unemployed is a classic example, but there are others. So that's compensating for market failure. That was the argument that we put. But as I say, there's still a lot more, I think, to be done on all of that. So that's the second. And of course, technology in relation to that. The huge role being, I mean, so much of all this is being remodeled by technology. Tristram Hooley, my colleague over here, has written a lot about all of this. And it's really crucial that we harness technology, but not just as a simple replacement. I mean, the way in which we think of technology can be that this is a tool, or that it's an alternative. We don't need these human services anymore. It's an alternative. I mean, people just can have the technology and can go into some website and sort it. Rubbish. Seriously rubbish, actually. But there's masses you can do of resources, but not just that, it's about interaction with people and social media and so on and so forth. So maybe it isn't either of those, it's an agent of change. And I think that's the way in which we should see it. It's an agent of change in which we can remodel all these services and programs, able to do things we could not do before, and arguably to do more without there being the costs going up at the same kind of rate, commensurately. So that's the second. Third is that statement that's there. I think in the OECD review and these others, we said actually no country has yet developed an adequate lifelong career development system. But if you look across the range of countries and what they're doing, you could see what it would look like. You can see if you did what they're doing and what they're doing and what they're doing, then you would have a genuine lifelong career development system. And the goal is that it should be so and should be coherent and transparent to the individual. And it's not a million miles away, because you can see across the range of countries what that might actually look like. I have, as I said that an old age career guidance service I think is helpful in terms of as a model, and I think it is still probably the strongest, but it's not the only one. There are others. It could work in other ways, but it's probably more difficult without it. So that's the third. How are we doing? 8 minutes. Right. Okay. I'm worried about your drinks. Okay. Fourth then, there's a need for strong coordination and leadership structures in order to articulate a vision and develop a strategy. If there's all these different players, different sectors and so forth, we've got to find some way of bringing them together. And that's true in government. It always crosses at least 2 ministries, often more, and where you've got devolved systems, a lot more. It certainly involves social partners, employers and trade unions. They have a genuine interest in this, and are providers, but they also have a wider interest. Then there's a whole range of other stakeholders that have an interest, and of course there's the professionals who are actually providing the services and programs. How do we get some kind of coherence between all of that? And in the European Union, we have a thing called the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, which all these countries come together to look at policy issues. And there's been strong encouragement for countries to set up national career guidance forums and actually pretty well all countries have. They take different forms, but there is some kind of mechanism to bring together all this whole range of bodies to try and get greater coherence and so forth. It's not easy, it's always complex, but there are structures designed to do that. You haven't got anything like that in Australia. You have got CECA, which brings together the professional associations, but you have not, I think, had a mechanism to bring together that wider range of organisations. So coordination and cooperation is really important. Fifth, partly to develop that kind of coherence, there is a really important role for strategic instruments to make the field more coherent. We need structures, but we also need instruments and tools and frameworks and so forth in at least 3 respects, and some countries have developed these: competence frameworks for all the practitioners in the field, covering all the different sectors, so that's linked with professional standards. Organisational quality standards, we have in the UK a thing called Matrix, which is all the services. They have service standards, and that's very interesting. It includes the professional standards of the practitioners, but it's broader than that. And then there is career management competency frameworks, of which you have in Australia, you've got the blueprint, which defines all of that, and here in Victoria, you've got the careers curriculum framework as well. So a lot of work's been done on all that, but all of those things can be done on a lifelong basis. The blueprint is lifelong, the others are lifelong. So they kind of cohere the field. So that, and then finally, the issue of marketing. I want to say something about that. In the European Union, there was a resolution, there have been 2 resolutions of the Council of Education Ministers, and the one in 2004 said, services need to be available at times and in forms which encourage all citizens to continue to develop their skills and competencies throughout their lives, links to changing needs in the labour market. Okay? And then it added, such services need to be viewed as an active tool and individuals positively encouraged to use them. That's the public good argument. There's no point just having... Sometimes when we did these reviews, we said, have you got adult services? Oh yes, we have. Great, can we go visit them please? Fine. Where do we find one? Great, it's on the 7th floor. We go up to the 7th floor. There's some nice little documents and things there, but there's nobody there. And we say, where are the people? And then we say, do you mark it? Oh, no, we don't mark it because we'd already be overrun if we did. What is the point of having a service which you don't promote? In the UK, a few years ago, the government supported, on this principle, the notion that we should have a helpline. It was promoted through advertising on television in prime watching hours. In the evening, when you are watching your soap opera, up came the ad which says, do you want to change your lives? Do you want to learn? Do you want to do this? With a telephone number. Within a year or so, that helpline was receiving, wait for it, how many calls do you think it might have received? Over 1 million calls. Think about it. That shows the potential demand there is if it's elicited through marketing. People want it. They want help. They want to rethink their lives. They want to think about what they might do next. But you've got to pay for it then, because that costs money. But we did, and we did have a service, and you can manage helplines reasonably cost effectively, actually. But that showed the level of the demand. When I did the review in New Zealand, it was very interesting because they did have a helpline, but the level of marketing spend proportionately to the population was under a quarter of that for the UK helpline. The level of brand recognition, which is people in the general public, do they recognise the brand? In the UK, at its peak, it was over 80%. In New Zealand, it was under 30%. And the level of take-up was proportionately much, much lower as well. Makes total sense. I mean, that's what you'd expect. If you market, people know about it, they've heard about it. If they've heard about it, there's a chance they'll use it. If you don't, they won't. In the UK, we've now cut back on marketing, and surprise, surprise, the volumes have gone right down. So this issue is a really important one. It is, does this matter? Is it serious? Do we really want people to do this? And that's why we have these services, because it's activating people to take control of their lives and to manage their careers in a way which is linked with the changing nature of the labour market, but they're doing it. And therefore you get a much more vibrant economy, you get people who are using their lives, moving forward in their lives, and therefore you get a society where all of that is driving forward. Or frankly, is it marginal stuff? It doesn't really matter very much. People will work out what they're going to do in the end anyway. They've got friends, they've got contacts, they can go on the web, they can pick stuff up. This is people making choices about their lives. That's complex stuff about who they are and who they want to become. Complex stuff. And the issue is whether we want to engage with that or not. So I think marketing is crucial. We've got to think about marketing. If we take it seriously, that's got to be a part of it. So I've talked a bit about impact. I think I can cut through that. How many minutes now? 2 or 3. Okay, 2 or 3. I think I'll go for 3. Okay. I say there's lots of stuff. There's lots of paper, lots of reports, and I think a lot of very, very interesting stuff. There's some stuff, there's been some critical stuff alongside it, which sort of critiques some of all this, linked with globalization and neoliberal policy, sees this as being part of neoliberal policy, so from a kind of Foucauldian position, it sort of critiques all of this, which is interesting, it's got things to say. I think in the end rather nihilistic, but it's important to actually think about that. More subtly, Ronald Sultana, who is one of the people who I've done quite a lot, a number of colleagues have been really important parts of all this. Richard Sweet's one. Ronald Sultana, who's at the University of Malta. Very interesting, coming from a very small country. It gives a different perspective, actually. But he wrote some very interesting stuff on the ethical dilemmas of this kind of work. Acting as a kind of boundary person between global and local influences. Very, very perceptive, thoughtful stuff. So there's quite an interesting literature around all of this. It's very important these reviews aren't just one-off, but is it going to be funded again? I'm prodding OECD, hoping they're going to do something, but they operate differently now, and whether they will, who knows, we'll see. But it would be great if they did, because all this stuff's a bit out of date now. And of course, it'd be really interesting to see what has happened during the gap, and also what the impact of the reviews was. I mean, there would be an opportunity to look at all of that. Doing these reviews has been a real privilege. I have done quite a lot of them. I think of the visits, I can't remember how many countries were visited altogether, I think it was 30 odd, and I've done 23 of the countries, and it's a fascinating way of visiting a country, actually. Because you see all sorts of things. You see the education system, you see the labour market system, you see some of the culture, you see all sorts of things in a very intense period of time. I'm a rubbish tourist now. It's so boring going around churches and museums. Well, it isn't, it's lovely. But it is actually, in the end, you don't find out very much about the country, actually. Or you look at some beautiful things and say, wasn't that lovely? And you have a nice meal, and then you go home. But actually, if you do this kind of stuff, you meet people who are talking about their lives and about things that are happening, but in that broader kind of context. And it is absolutely fascinating. Career guidance, career development is a peculiar entity. It's always somewhat fragile in policy terms, I think. Why? Well, because I suppose it focuses on processes rather than structures. Policy is much easier when it's kind of very clear-cut in terms of structures. It focuses on the individual rather than on systems. Policies like to develop systems. And it's helping people to move across policy silos, and governments all work in terms of policy silos. And the policy silos determine so much of what happens. And you can redesign where the silos are, but all you're doing is just shifting the goalpost, really. The goalpost's still there. And if you don't shoot into the net, you hit it wide, you're not going. And if you're kind of trying to help people, I don't think I can follow this analogy through, actually. But anyway, if you're trying to help people to move from one bit to another, you tend to be kind of marginal in relation to all the bits. So you tend to be seen as being well, yeah, I'll say marginal, maybe even kind of risking betrayal in a way. I don't know. But I'm pushing it a bit. But I say always at risk of being marginalised. But, in my view, it is a key lubricant to make systems work. Without it, systems operate impersonally. In the education system, it's bums on seats, it's filling courses, serving organisational goals, which may or may not, and often are not, congruent with the interests of individuals and of the wider society and the economy. Organisations' interests are not always congruent with those. What career guidance does, and career development does, by placing the individual at the centre, it seeks to ensure that attention is paid to human rights and to human liberties. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for a typically entertaining and very insightful presentation. I think one of the main messages that I've received from the many teachers that we've brought to Cambridge to listen to you, Tony, is that you help them to think outside the narrow confines of their own work in schools, thinking beyond the demands of what subjects does this kid need to choose in order to get into law or psychology or medicine. And I think you've done that tonight as well. You've helped us think beyond the confines of what we usually regard as careers guidance and to see some of the big pictures. So we thank you very much for that. Many of us here tonight know that you're winding down your academic activities over the next year or so. So I think we're very fortunate to have had the opportunity to listen to you and to benefit from your wisdom and your knowledge. We're bringing our study group to St Cat's again in September next year, and it's sad that that's actually going to be the last group that we'll be bringing to listen to you. But as our Dean's already mentioned, we've had a very successful and long collaboration with you, and that's something that really is very important, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for that and wish you the very best as you move on to the next stage of your life, enjoying the important things like family and music, I understand, Handel. I'd like to include cricket as well,
Absolutely.
But I know that's a sensitive topic given what happened in Brisbane.
I'm quietly confident. Quietly confident.
I'm glad.
Ever optimistic.
Tony, thank you again for a wonderful collaboration over many years and for a wonderful lecture tonight.
Thank you very much, John.